thanks everybody. We'll wait just a minute here for our panel to get up here. While we're doing that, I'll just say, I guess you've either stuck around for Safety First, which is the last panel, either because you're really interested in safety or you're wondering why you booked such a late flight this evening. But either way, we appreciate it, and we're looking forward to a great conversation here. I'll say we met about a couple weeks ago by phone and had about an hour to talk about all this, and I think we figured we could probably go another 3. But in the interest of getting you all out of here, we will try to keep it to a crisp 50 minutes or so, and definitely want to take your questions at the end of that time. So just a little bit of context for why we're all gathered here. We are all EHS professionals in some form or fashion. As was said, I'm with the National Safety Council. I lead our Campbell Institute, which is our center of excellence for environmental health and safety at the organization. And one of the new things that we're doing is actually launching an initiative called Work to Zero, which is focused on really the intersection between digital transformation and Industry 4.0 and safety. And so really looking at what technology sets are going to be the most effective for preventing and eliminating serious injuries and fatalities on the job. So really excited to be able to bring this panel together. All of these folks, organizations are part of the Campbell Institute. So that was not necessarily by design, but was a great side feature. And I can promise you they have a lot of great things to share. So I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So we'll start with Cathy here.
All right, good afternoon. I was here this morning as well, so I know y'all can't get enough of me. Quick reintroduction in case you missed this morning. My name is Cathy White. I am an EH&S project leader at Dow, and I'm part of our EH&S Operations Technology Center. So there's a small group of us looking at innovations specific to EH&S and how we can apply them at the company to achieve a breakthrough in our injury, illness, health, performance.
Good afternoon. I'm Clint Wernimont. I work for Cummins, and I've been with Cummins over 20 years, all in health and safety. And within the last month, I was tapped to lead our innovation, health and safety innovation work, really just to try to determine what is it in the I4O that we're already doing, how can we leverage that to improve safety, and how to measure those improvements. So excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for sticking with us, gang. I know it's kind of late in the day, but I'm Jim Dorris. I'm the Vice President, Health, Safety, Environment, and Sustainability for United Rentals, but also get involved in innovation in our solutions group.
And Ryan Ringelman, BNSF Railway, I head up our system safety group, which includes regulatory compliance, safety, ergonomics, traditional safety activities, and support for all of our operating functions, which would include supporting them through the use of appropriate technologies.
Great. Well, thank you all for that. We're going to get started here with a topic that's come up quite a bit over the past couple of days, and I think we'll probably add to it a little bit and hopefully not repeat too much of what we've heard. But I think one of the big challenges from the safety perspective is identifying which technologies and which sort of hazardous situations you really want to go dig deep into and go investigate for potential technology solutions. And we heard a lot about over the past couple of days, identifying the problem first and not just throwing technology at something that you find a use case for, really looking for where your pain points are. And from a safety perspective, obviously, we've got to spend our time and energy where it's going to be most effective and most important. So that identification of where you want to go, what you want to try to solve for, as well as how you after identifying a problem, go wide, pilot that, scale that, and move on from there. So that's certainly something I think a lot of our panelists take slightly different approaches to or have different mechanisms for in terms of how they form that strategy and that roadmap. So maybe just starting in order here, and we'll eventually mix things up a little bit, but maybe we'll start with Cathy first and get her perspective on that.
Okay, great. And I don't want to be redundant with what I talked about this morning as far as what our company's strategy is. So I'm going to speak more to how do we hone in from all of these great ideas that are out there in that ideation space. We actually have 5 phases that we go through with any ideas that come down what we call our innovation pipeline. But it starts with ideation, and somebody has an idea of something that looks on the surface to be great to do. And we move into a team format where we get into what we call concept shaping. Okay, cool, this is an interesting idea. How would we actually apply this in the workplace? And then what is the value that would be created? Obviously, from an EH&S perspective, we could potentially recognize some savings, but we try to dig a little bit deeper. We start to kind of charter out a project and what that would look like and what sorts of resources would it actually take to do something here. And then there might be some bench testing that happens along in there to just even figure out on the surface, is this something that could even possibly work in our facility? And if so, then we actually have a stage gate review process that takes place before we go to what we call a proof of concept to say, okay, here's what we're looking at, here's the value we believe could be derived, and we've looked at this a little bit. We want to actually get it out into the field now and do some testing with some user population. So that's kind of the first few phases, and then if that's successful, we can start talking about piloting. But we're very big on what I would call front end loading that process, because we try to just get rid of the stuff that we recognize early on. Maybe the usability is an issue. Maybe there's some IT cybersecurity issues that we just don't have the appetite for today. And we maintain all of our ideas in a database because sometimes something comes up later. And I have some technologies I'm starting to drive now that we didn't have an appetite for 18 months ago, but now we do. So it's important to kind of have some sort of system in place, I think, for the idea generations and the concepts that you're shaping and just your overall project list, because things can come and go, and then something might happen. I'll say from a safety perspective, maybe you have a significant incident that occurs, and it's good at those points to have an evergreen process where you say, okay, we haven't been talking about or looking at this technology and it wasn't on our roadmap, but we've had this thing happen, and now maybe technology could play a role or a piece in that process to help us ensure that something like this does not repeat.
Clint?
Yeah, so that's where we want to go. So having just started on this journey, Cummins has lived through innovation for 100 years. So we have a pretty good innovation process. Now it's how do I carve out a path for HSE to utilize those tools and that system that's already in place. So currently, a lot of our innovation ideas and stuff come from the people who have the pain. They have the problem, and so they're going out and trying to figure out a solution to this problem without any sort of centralized support. And that's the role we kind of want to fill, that we recognize is really a value to Cummins. So we're building an innovation hub. It's the same way we've done innovation with our products and our services for years. And we'll start to gather some of the great work that's going on around the globe. And as I'm beginning to understand, there is a lot of great work going on around the globe at our manufacturing sites and our service and distribution centers. So.
Yep. So, my grandfather used to say, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's really what John was getting at, is that you don't want to force fit the technology to the problem. It should be the other way around, so that the tail's not wagging the dog. We've got a very similar innovation process as that Cathy described for Dow, where it's a very systematic process that we go through, and framework that we use to evaluate technologies, especially new ones. But it also changes a bit in terms of the context of the application of the technology. So for safety, our main concern is evaluating the technology that's going to reduce or help to mitigate unreasonable risk. But for productivity, that context may be very different. So, there's a slight twist on that, and the way that we try to evaluate it is look at those tasks that we could eliminate or dramatically reduce through the application of the technologies that we're investigating. But just broadly having that framework and that systematic process, and again, not trying to force fit the technology is really the goal that we take with piloting and implementing new technologies.
Yeah, and I'll just wrap up what everyone else said. It's very similar for us. We have, I like if you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail. But we look at it sometimes through the opposite light too, which is in safety, oftentimes there's a lot of urgency around. You might have identified a problem and you're looking for a solution. You might have had an incident that led to or resulted in a bad outcome for one of our teammates. And so there's a lot of urgency around wanting to change, wanting to find a solution to prevent that from ever happening again. And with urgency in our step, we also have to take a methodical approach to ensure that we're not just forcing in a technology or putting a technology and wrapping it around a bad process. So making sure that potential solution or approach fits the process that we have today or meshes with the process we'll have tomorrow, and then really getting into the user integration. How does that user accept or adopt that technology into their working environment? So a pretty robust, methodical approach, but oftentimes, as I said, starting with a lot of urgency, because when it comes to safety, there's urgency around ensuring that we take the next step to avoid those types of incidents.
Yeah, and one of the things we were talking about earlier as a panel just before this was, the degree to which EHS sits in a support function role in a lot of these conversations. And, sometimes we're driving our own strategic roadmaps forward from an EHS technology perspective. Other times we're kind of just riders on the boat of ops or manufacturing or whatever the primary process is in your organization, and really just trying to influence and say, hey, if there's a safety value for this too, we're certainly going to support it. So that's been something I think we've, as safety professionals, have been very happy to see here in a room that's probably mostly not safety professionals. The adoption and the acceptance of safety is one of the pillars of these kind of strategic road mapping discussions. Maybe we'll start back down on the other end with Ryan with this question and give him first crack at it. But maybe opening the aperture up a little bit. We've been talking a lot about AR mixed reality, VR sorts of applications. Yesterday, we're focusing a little bit on below the neck wearables as they've called them today. But just maybe a wider perspective, Industry 4.0, certainly focus on wearables. But what other sorts of technologies are you really putting your chips on in your organization? Where are you focusing your effort? What are some of the applications that you're really utilizing right now?
Yeah, and so at a very high level, I think it starts across our operating platform. It starts with how we do training. And so from not AR, XR, but even wearables, at our training level, how we're simulating at work activities as we bring new people, integrate them into our company and into our culture, how they're learning to do the tasks that they're doing. And so when it comes to the wearable world there, certainly we have simulation trainers and AR integration into that, but what does right body positioning feel like? And so we move a lot of heavy machinery, use heavy tools in the railroad industry, and even, for example, throwing a switch. A switch is a big mechanical device that bends the rail, right, so that you can adjust the track that train would go down. And that involves some use of force. And so getting your body properly positioned to do that, and not just training through a PowerPoint or through a discussion or even through a demonstration, but getting some wearables where a person can begin to develop that muscle memory of what does right really feel like and how do I continue that throughout my career, and then bringing them back, starting at the very front end and bringing them back to that as they progress through their career to remember what good body positioning feels like, in relation to the task that they're performing.
Jim?
Yeah, thanks, John. For me, I'm really fascinated by, especially around the simulation. I know we're talking about below body, but to follow on with what Ryan was talking about is, in my view, it's almost a land grab to go out and develop all of this content. But what does that content really mean? So the certification of competency by using AR, VR, XR, whatever, however you want to, but whatever bucket you want to put it in, is what I've really focused on in bringing in the science of our scientists, of psychometricians, and really validating that these environments and tasks that we're creating in these environments mean something. Somebody actually walks away with what right feels like and is competent to do that task. And then how do you archive that and pin it to this person in a way that they can carry it with them from job to job? Because what we're seeing is there's a lot of transient movement in the workforce these days. So how are some of the things that they're learning in these environments? How do they follow them and build upon themselves to create this really transparent view of what people are competent at, and how does that mean, or what does that mean for them? You know, how does it make them more marketable, or you know, how does that qualify them to upskill into a new task or area? So that's where a lot of my focus has been on with the technology.
Yeah, so training is a big part of making sure that people are doing things the right way and they know and they understand it. I've had the benefit this week of being here with some of our global manufacturing folks and some folks from our distribution and service business units, and so it's interesting to me to see how we're all looking at kind of the same technology and it's crossing over, right? I'm gonna gain the benefit from the work that they are doing, without having to provide a great deal of input on why. All I need to do is measure in the end the fact that, hey, they're focused on reducing variation in the process, right? And I know from our metrics that whenever we are out of process, bad things can happen, right? We design processes to be safe. But when the process doesn't go as it was designed and people start making decisions about what the next step is, that's where sometimes things can get off the rails. So we're going to benefit hugely from the work that's being done within global manufacturing, and that touches onto all of the Internet of Things, from additive manufacturing and 3D printing and the work that they're doing to build ergonomic tools real time. At the plant and at the shop floor, that we just gain the benefit. They're gaining the efficiency, we're gaining the safety, and we all suddenly have the same end goal, right? And that's really cool to me. So that's the part of the I4O stuff that has me super excited is the fact that now what sometimes could be perceived as rowing against each other in ops and safety, we are definitely rowing together now.
Cathy, have you seen similar things in your organization?
I could go in so many directions with this question, so I'm going to just focus my answer on below the neck wearables, because we have 4 different platforms we call it manufacturing 4.0, but it is industry 4.0, so I'm not going to talk about robotics or process automation, process control. I'm just going to focus on mobility, and that's really the platform that I'm primarily going to speak from today, since that's the world I live in. But I'll start with just sharing the vision that we have when it comes to mobility at Dow, which is that we're taking a concept that we've historically applied to equipment and machinery across our company of things like sensors, right, in vessels, pipelines, understanding what conditions are taking place there prior to an event that could result in downtime at our facility, right? So taking that concept of predictive analytics and applying it to a human being, that's essentially what we're trying to do in our mobility platform. And that concept extends beyond EH&S, but from the perspective of EH&S, what we're trying to do is to be able to predict incident, illness, health impacts prior to them actually occurring. That's really at our heart what we're trying to do. So a lot of the projects that we're driving are coming from that vision, from that perspective. And it's really been a journey that we started on, I would say, with an emphasis about 2 years ago or so. As I mentioned earlier, we've spent a lot of time in this discovery ideation mode in the last 18 months or so, and it's been an interesting process because the concept and the vision that I shared on the surface sounds really cool, and it sounds like something we should all get behind, right? But obviously there's a lot of considerations that need to be taken into account, and that's been part of our discovery process, is just understanding what kind of barriers exist to even getting something into a facility for a proof of concept. And that extends beyond wearability and usability. You got to start thinking about things like data privacy, cybersecurity, IT security. We have an entire risk assessment process with human resources, legal. We have a risk assessment team. We've spent a lot of time talking about all of these sorts of wearables technology, and what do we need to do to actually get this in a facility and know that the information is going to be secure, and knowing, as has been mentioned, I think in earlier sessions, just because something goes to a cloud does not mean it's safe, right? So trying to work through a lot of those issues, as well as the day-to-day management of technology, the coolness factor that people have when they initially see something versus us stepping back and taking a long view as to how would this work on a day-to-day basis. Because today somebody might think it's super cool, and in a month, they're not wanting to put on that device anymore for whatever reason. And so trying to figure out how to get ahead of that, it's part of our front-end loading process, as well as not jumping to technology as the first solution. So we actually do human-centered design workshops. A lot of times I'll have a leader running to me like, we need to do this now. Well, wait a second. And yes, I know I'm being repetitive. What is the problem you're trying to solve? But part of what we do in the workshops is sit down and talk about what other ways can we do this. Maybe technology is the solution or part of it, but likely it's not the entire solution. So like I said, it's been a big discovery process.
Yeah, and I like that. I mean, as safety professionals in general, we try not to do a whole lot of anything without involving the end user and understanding, from the perspective of the person who's doing the work, they probably have a really good idea of what safe and unsafe look like and what their challenges are. But it seems like in the technology space, we sometimes ignore that part of it and just jump to the shiny object and jump to what we see here, there, elsewhere, and what we kind of get sold on internally. And there's a danger there in creating those kind of echo chambers. But I think for a lot of the organizations on stage, we've been fairly successful at avoiding some of that. But I maybe wanted to focus on one thing Cathy mentioned, which is the user acceptance and challenge, kind of part of the coin here. And it's not even just about it's cool on day 1 and then it's not so cool on day 30, as it is you get a lot of people who are just never going to want to engage in any of this stuff. And in a training perspective, we used to call those cave people, the citizens against virtually everything. Folks who will just, no matter what you're going to throw at them, no matter what quality of life it's going to give them, it's new and they're never going to want to engage in it. So from a user acceptance perspective, just wondering, and maybe I'll start with Jim here on this one. What have you seen from a challenge side of the coin, either from user acceptance, data privacy, any of those kind of big pillar issues that seem to be roadblocks for a lot of these kind of implementations?
Yeah, thanks for that, John. My view on this is it follows the law of diffusion of innovation, right? I mean, we've got early adopters and we've got a chasm, and then we've got folks on the other side of the chasm, just broadly, and particularly with some of the wearables, you start getting into VR, AR. What we've seen, and the presenter before us, mentioned that a lot of the younger folks are very interested in piloting and learning that way. So we're seeing this distribution of learning preferences, and it's really trying to cater the technology to meet people where they are and where those preferences are. And it's just interesting to see, particularly with our younger workforce, because a lot of them are truly digital natives, right? They're coming to us, and there's never been a time in their life that in some way, shape or form, that their reality hasn't been augmented with an iPad or with some form of mobile device. And then we've got people that are 40-year veterans, right? That just really their mind processes and their preferences are completely different. So that's, in terms of challenge of user acceptance, that's been it. As we're at a point in history where we have to offer a broad spectrum of approaches that include technology and that are analog to be able to get at everybody that we're trying to train or influence or whatever.
Thanks, Jim. I'll maybe ask Ryan to follow up on that one, just because I know from a demographic perspective, you have a really interesting user base, for lack of a better word. So wondering how that's looked for BNSF.
Indeed. I think like many companies, ours is probably somewhat different in a way, but we have a wide range of workforce. Because of the way railroad retirement systems are set up, people tend to stay for a long period of time. And we had a guy who just retired not too long ago that said, if you leave the railroad before 40 years of service, you're quitting, you're not retiring. And so we get some people that are long in the tooth. And I would say that there's a range. I mean, there's a range of folks that are resistant to change, resistant to new technology because they've done it a particular way for 35, 40 years, and it's worked for them. We have a lot of new hiring going on, so new blood coming into that, which is very exciting. And it really takes, I think, from our perspective of how we've approached it, is really developing a culture where we have peer-to-peer interactions, and so that you can communicate about those types of things, technology being one of them, and how do we integrate that cultural approach with our technology approach to bridge that gap, like you talked about, the chasm. On the other side of that, I also am somewhat cognizant of we want to encourage and foster development and challenging the status quo mentalities, but we also don't want to overdo the pace of change. And so there are the people on the other end of the technology spectrum that will jump to every new thing without letting things settle and mature and letting that process evolve. And so we really are mindful of that as well. And one other thing I'll just throw in there too, and following up on something kind of Cathy said, the other challenge that I think some of us face is a very active regulatory environment. And so we also have to be very cognizant of, it's not just we like this technology, let's leap into it, and then we move to the next one. There have been several times within the past 2 decades where we have pursued a technology that then a regulator, I will use the unfortunate term of gloms onto, and establishes that as now being a regulatory required use of a technology, which then really inhibits your ability to change and to flex the time. So you're managing a lot of workflows there, and the regulatory one, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out, occasionally the regulator can get in the way of good progress as well.
Interesting perspective too, because on the typical side, not railway, but in the OSHA world, a lot of it is chasing what the new technology is and trying to come to terms with it, and understanding how it fits against a very very static sort of set of regulations. So interesting perspective there. Clint, maybe to turn the question to you, you have some widely varied business units in terms of, very regulated manufacturing environments, and then distribution sort of environments where there's a lot of unsupervised, unstructured work. So just wondering, is that really factored in from a user acceptance or just a general cultural point of view from a technology side?
Yeah, for sure, John. So in our distribution business, that's our folks who go out and service our products wherever those products may reside, right? So if it's something that comes into a shop, they service it there. If they need to go to the mine or into the belly of the boat or out onto an oil platform, they go where the work is, right? And one piece of wearable technology that we've kind of scaled, at least within North America, is lone worker monitoring, because it's a big deal for us. We're working with engines, so we need to monitor carbon monoxide levels and things like that, and we need to make sure that we have the ability to be in constant contact with our people. Interesting part is you have to be really transparent with them about the value of wearing the monitor, because I was looking at some feedback that we had gotten from folks, and they were claiming that they need to move the monitor like 7 times a job, because it's in their way, or if they bump it, and honestly, their first inclination is to shut it off and take it off, right? And that's only if they don't understand the value that it's providing to them. So you have to be really transparent with them about that, and I think we're getting over that hump. Some of the tech that we're using is older. I don't even think we can get it anymore. So that's, it's like 2 years old. So that's really old. So, it's, and what I've seen both at National Safety Congress and here is that, hey, the tech is getting better. It's getting more reliable. It's getting smaller. It's getting easier for the folks to be able to utilize it as part of their everyday job. And I think that if we've done a good job on the value proposition for them, making the hardware easier for them is just going to get us over that hump, and then it'll be on to the next thing, where we're in the manufacturing facility and we're talking about exoskeletons, or we're talking about ergonomic position monitors, and I don't think it's ever going to end, the journey. So I'm pretty excited.
And Cathy, well, since you raised this question, maybe turn it back to you at the end. And I'm interested in particular. I know Dow sets some really aggressive long-range goals that often require some creative thinking, and I'm wondering how that bleeds down to the workforce in terms of their acceptance of some of those solutions. When I think about something like eliminating confined space entry, within 5 years, which is kind of one of the goals Dow's set for itself. And so that kind of aggressive goal, hopefully pushes everybody in that direction, but I'm sure there's still some user acceptance issues down at the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have some really lofty goals in the injury illness space, the health space, safe driving, like I mentioned, telematics across all of our Dow-owned vehicles. That's one of our goals. It's very lofty, especially as we start talking about things like cybersecurity, data privacy, but there's the strategy the company has, and then there's your everyday board operator in the control room. So they're not necessarily going on the Dow internet and looking at the goals, and the whole what's in it for me factor is not really relatable in that perspective from the top down. So when we start looking at technology and implementation and user acceptance, obviously we need to make sure we apply that human-centered design approach that I mentioned. So when we do these workshops and we go in with a really clear problem statement and we go through this brainstorming session of how do we get after this issue, we try to make sure everybody's represented. So we actually had a session recently talking about how do we ensure, because we're working on fitness for duty right now, so how do we ensure that people who are coming in on their shift are alert, they're ready to work, and they're going to be able to perform at that level throughout their work shift, right? So there's probably a variety of ways we can get after that issue, right? But we need to make sure we got the right players in the room to even talk about that. So we involved health services, human resources, right? Operations from the perspective of production leaders, operations leaders, and we had some shift workers, we had some operators in there. What was really cool about this workshop, and this is where I think this is an important element as well, we want the users to accept, but we really need leadership support. I don't run any kind of POC or pilot if we don't have that engagement from business or site leadership, because it's just not going to fly. Grassroots efforts are super difficult in this space. So when we do these workshops, I make sure we have that engagement from the business, the site, and that they're willing to pony up some resources to actually sit with us for a full day workshop. And it's pretty cool, actually. In this example, one of the shift workers that came had been asked to come in to help cover a little bit overtime, and he was able to say no because the site director had said, hey, you're going to this workshop. We need to talk about this and figure out how to get around it. And like I said, some of the solutions were around more management system culture issues, but we did have a technology piece, and as part of the workshop, when we start delving into that, we ask them, I mean, what kind of barriers do you think would happen if this came into your facility? And it's pretty cool when you got folks like that who are going to straight up tell you what's going to fly, because you also have IT people in the room saying, oh, what if we tried to gamify this? I think this would be so cool on your phone. And, this person's more younger. I hate saying younger, but, they're more of that millennial generation versus, talking to this experienced operator. And so you start to make these connections, and that diversity of thought is really important, because what could work for maybe a less experienced operator isn't going to be what flies for our more seasoned veterans in the facility. So that workshop methodology has really helped us identify ways to get around user acceptance, as well as identifying other ways that we might be able to solve that problem.
And I think the demographic shift is really something that we probably ought to pay more attention to in the future on this topic. It's something that's, recent studies are showing, millennials and beyond will be 50% of the workforce by 2025, and that's pretty much tomorrow. So I think that's really going to change a lot of what drives this conversation. And I also like to think, folks who are only a couple years younger than me feel like they can do just about anything because they saw how to do it on YouTube. And when we think about automated work instructions and some of these things in an AR setting, got to make sure we're not building too much complacency into the way that we create those solutions, and people thinking they can do it just because they're seeing step 1, step 1A, step 1B. Sometimes there's some nuance and knowledge that goes into that isn't going to be on your heads-up display. So interesting future topic. I'll acknowledge here too that we talked a lot on the phone about ROI, and we're asked to kind of cover a little bit of that as part of this discussion. So I'll just say, we've heard a lot about ROI throughout the past couple of days. I think the consensus of the panel, if I'm not overstating it, is that especially when it comes to safety, we're not really looking at hard ROI. And if we were, we'd probably never get any of these pilots off the ground in the first place. So there's a lot of faith that goes into that, and the fact that we acknowledge that there's a soft cost to safety, and there's a hard cost to safety, and soft value and hard value from safety. So I don't know if any of the panel wanted to comment on any of that before we moved on. But Jim,
Yeah, John, I mean, I think you're spot on with it, right? I mean, if you did focus on the ROI, especially compared to an opportunity cost with an established business, you're not ever going to get there. The real opportunity is to be working in the technology now. So when it is at scale, you've built that competency to be able to capture that opportunity. And that's really what our leadership team is centered on, is that we know that we're making bets for 10 years from now, because a lot of the technology that we're dealing with today is not highly distributed, but it'll be the technology that moves the mark when it hits scale. And listening to some of the other, presentations over the last couple of days, and that has been a lot of the conversation, is that technology's not quite there, but it's getting there. But it's just so important to be building competency in these technologies now, so that you can capture opportunities 5-10 years down the road.
Really good point. Clint, maybe I'll pitch this fourth question over to you here. Give you a little time to think about it up front. One of the big challenges, and we've talked a lot, I think someone yesterday, used the phrase that I've been hearing for a long time now, which is, data is the new oil, or data is the oil of the future. As safety professionals, we have a lot of data that we're already grappling with. We're trying to muddle through, the relative value of a lot of the proactive metrics and leading indicators that we want to track, and that's before you start getting into things like AI and algorithms that really just blow out the world in terms of the amount of data you can track. And then all these wearables and sensors and other devices are streaming in data by the second, and we're barely getting our arms around what we have to begin with. So just wondering, from your perspective, Quentin, in terms of how you're dealing with that, and what Cummins' perspective might be, and then I'll kind of throw that to the rest of the panel.
Yeah. So John, that's a really good question, right? So one thing that we struggle with at times is, as safety folks, we want all the data, right? We want to know everything about everything, especially when it comes to, if there's an incident and we're trying to dig the root cause, we want to know, the temperature and was it left-handed or right-handed? And I mean, we want to know everything. And currently, the way we gather all of that information, or a lot of that information, is through people gathering that data. I think the thought that we can start to gather really meaningful data that will help us on things like incident investigation, root cause analysis, through a means where it doesn't take a human interaction. It's not one of our already overburdened safety resources sitting down and putting some information into a management system. It's literally real time, pouring in all the time, and then it's there for the liking, right, and for the taking. Now that does lead us into needing some assistance from data analytics and that sort of thing, and that's where I really think the next big leap for us is going to take place is understanding what do we already have, what are the gaps in the data that we have now, how can we gather other data without a human interaction. I mean, that's one of the things that I've put on my whiteboard to say, hey, I love data, but I don't want somebody to have to input it, because we've been getting beat on asking them to input data for a really long time. So I want to gather data. I want to understand what's going on out there. I want to know, but now what do I do with it? And so started to engage with our data analytics group, and they're brilliant in their own way. They know a lot about numbers. They don't know a lot about safety. And so when they suggest that they can use facial recognition to determine whether or not somebody's wearing a hard hat, I say, great. I can tell if they're wearing a hard hat without 10 gigabytes of data, right? So how can we solve problems and not just use data for the sake of using data?
Cathy, sounds like you might have a follow-up
I
thought.
do. Yeah, this is a really good question because our company is comprised of a lot of chemical engineers who love data, and I'm an industrial engineer, so I like it too. But here's the danger that you can fall into, especially going back to the topic of data privacy and talking to our legal team. I've learned a little bit, but basically, once you know something about somebody, you have to follow up, right? Because if you don't, and something happens to them from a safety perspective, and let's say they file a lawsuit, now you need to be able to answer to that. So the concern that comes from a legal perspective is when you're collecting data and it's somewhere out there that you, company, have access to that data and something happens to that person, you're going to be able to have to demonstrate how you reacted. And if you didn't, because maybe you didn't see that data because you've got mounds of data, you've created duty, right? And so there's a lot of concerns that can go along with that. So something that we've actually become more cognizant about, I mean, you've probably heard about digital twin and some of these concepts, and it sounds really cool. Wow, why don't we have this interactive dashboard and we can just drown all kinds of data in there and know everything about anybody? We're kind of taking a step back from that and saying maybe we don't need all the bells and whistles that we thought we did. And I have a good example of that with physiological monitoring, because we started with a problem statement. I had a team of engineers, and we started to get into technology that was looking at all kinds of stuff within a bioharness. I mean, not just heart rate variability, breathing rate, energy expenditure, steps taken, are you upright or are you prone? And then the reports were just massive. And we just kind of took a step back a few months ago and said, wait a second, we've lost sight of the problem we're trying to solve because we just started looking at kind of what's available off the shelf and jumping into a solution. But what do we really need? We actually boiled it down to one metric that we truly need to collect in real time during the course of the shift, not off shift, and not these other 10 metrics. So sometimes I feel like you just need the VCR. Even though this technology is advancing, we're actually moving backwards and finding a technology that's existed for a number of years, not the newest and latest and greatest. And some of it is, I guess you could argue, protection from a data privacy perspective, but some of it's just, we need something simple. We need something quick, plug and play. A lot of us are safety professionals. We're not IT experts, and we have operations in remote locations where we're gonna need a safety person to be able to connect up a system and get off to the races. So that's been a major consideration that we've been trying to kind of scale back and keep it simple.
Well, Ryan is the resident lawyer on stage. I'm wondering if you had a perspective on that.
Will not play lawyer today. No, I think you hit a couple of really important points. And one, we always talk about if you're going to collect data, and we collect a ton of data, you've got to be able to do something with it. So finding a usability for that data. If you're just collecting something like the reference you made to, I know something about someone, I've got an inward facing camera in my car or my locomotive, and I see that somebody's sleeping every day, but I don't take action on that, that creates legal peril. But setting that aside, I always said I'd rather have the information and take action because we have zero liability for accidents that we avoid, and that's our goal. Our goal is to not have incidents, to not have injuries. And so the more we know, the better we are able to react, but we got to react. And so that was where I was going to kind of segue into that, was taking data, taking this large constellation of data that we have and finding trendable items in there or finding meaningful items in there, automating that to the extent possible, as you indicated, not just hand typed in or observed data, but then having people and making it a conscious choice of having people within your team or within your operation that play a very critical role in my mind, which is taking data and making it operational, understanding the operation enough to see what that data is telling you. Because we can get people that are very focused on data and really good at that, but don't understand how that wheel meets the rail in our world. And so finding that space in the middle of people who are good enough at reading data and good enough at understanding the operation to make that meaningful, so that you don't fall in that gap of, I've got a lot of data that told me something, but I couldn't overlay it into my world, and lo and behold, something unfortunate happened.
Right. And Jim, I know when we talked on the phone, we were talking a bit about, the sensitivity of data that you needed to get to solve a problem like slip, trips, and falls in an industrial setting, and, only now being able to get that level of sensitivity and how much data was needed. But, that's maybe just a starting point to your point of view on that, wondering where you might want to take that.
Yeah, I don't think I could add the broad topic of data and the fact that it's problematic that there's so much and how to make sense of it. I couldn't add anything that's going to bring any value to you guys. But what I will say is, you can zoom it down, and I'll give you a practical example. One of the things that we developed was a VR simulator for aerial equipment. And we were able to use that data from those simulations, like how somebody feathered the controls, if and when they looked up as they raised the lift. We were able to take all of that and work with psychometricians to be able to develop a score. And that score translated into someone's competency. And I know you all heard me talk about it. I'm fascinated by it and probably won't shut up if you catch me outside of this. Is, how does all the technologies that a lot of you play in, how does it roll up and mean something to a person? But I think that's one of the more creative ways that we have been able to take the data and use an empirical process. Right, to be able to demonstrate that the data actually meant something, and then pin that back and give it to, give it to that individual user or learner of the technology. So.
Well, thank you for that. It's been a really rich conversation here, as you can tell, and I think there's much more to probably say on this front on the safety side. One of the things that the council will be doing is publishing some work, covering all these topics coming up in February this year under that Work to Zero banner. So if you're interested in that, please do let me know afterward. I'd be glad to share all that with you. We've got about 4 minutes left based on the clock that is in front of me. So I think that leaves us some time to answer 1 or 2 questions that you all might have. So anybody have a question for the panel? One over here. All right.
Hey guys, my name is Sam Modi. I'm representing Delta Airlines. First of all, just wanted to thank you guys. You guys covered a lot of stuff and a lot of information. We really appreciate this. The question I have is, have you guys came across a case or a study where wearing a technology itself, for example, exoskeleton became a safety concern, got caught up somewhere, and the guy twisted his arm or leg or something? Have you guys came across anything like that?
Anyone have a perspective on that?
I can mention, at least with exoskeleton, we've been running a lot of pilots along that technology. So part of the evaluation process with any vendor that we're looking at is safety considerations. And I know there's some people from the ASTM F48 committee here, but there at least a draft document's been developed of some of those safety considerations, because you need to think about so many things from a safety perspective with that technology. But I mean, slips, trips, and falls. What about emergency egress situations? If it's an active exoskeleton, there's a number of concerns that could come up with the actuators and the battery, and you don't want the device to collapse on the user. I will say from our experience, we're focused on the passive devices. And so we have had situations come up in the piloting where we've recognized there's straps that could become what we call a snag hazard. So you kind of can go in a couple different directions with that, right? You could say, I'm going to try to work with this vendor and see if they can improve their design because we have this risk. But the other perspective might be just kind of depending on your operation, which, okay, you're at Delta. I love your airline, by the way. Maybe you have a more consistent routine operation, though, and you could apply potentially a risk assessment process to it. Like what we're working on is just developing some sort of risk assessment checklist. If you think that you might want to use this technology, here's the things you need to assess and evaluate in your workplace from a safety perspective prior to bringing that in, because we need to make sure we mitigate those types of situations, and that's the purpose of our piloting, identify those sorts of things before they come in the workplace in an implementation perspective.
Ryan, did you have a thought there?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a great question. We've not had experience, or we've not had an experience of an injury or exposure like that, in part because that's the challenge we've confronted, is where does that exoskeleton work in our environment? And do we have the type of activities with enough density that it makes sense to do it. And if you're climbing onto a rail car or off of a rail car or getting underneath a locomotive, that has been one of the challenges that we've not found the right use case for, just because you're putting a potential exposure that out measures the potential reward.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's a management change process issue, right? I mean, whenever we're bringing in a new technology, we really need to be looking at what new hazards or risks we're creating. So it's just the same as if we did a process change. Other questions? Yep, see one over there.
I stepped out a little bit, so I missed it. But do you see kind of a fit? Oh, sorry, I'm Max Suckland with Fluor. I'm in the construction group. So do you see a fit potentially with these wearables and VR? So having the training now incorporated with these functionality devices and kind of see if that's going to make a change with training.
Anyone have a thought on that one that I'd like to share?
Yeah, I think so. So the whole concept of VR and being able to train people on very specific tasks using very specific tools is not new, right? So we've been doing that for a little while. I like the idea that you just brought up. Like, hey, what if we incorporate some of the other wearable technology? Does that change the way we do our VR, right? Does that change the way that we address or look at the way the job gets done? And it absolutely does, right? The nice part about that is that they've, it's moving so fast towards this capability of being able to create new instructions and digitization at such a high rate of speed that you literally could change it, on the fly. So I think that's absolutely the direction it's going to go. But again, to what the rest of the panel's been saying, it all depends upon the use case, right? And whether or not the wearable technology actually makes sense in that situation or doesn't. And you kind of got to do that groundwork first before you get into, changing the whole world. So, but I'm with you.
And kind of related to that is just the fact that, convergence is always coming down the pipeline. But in the meantime, we got to figure out what we have right now and how we can utilize it. I mean, a lot of folks are waiting for the one wearable that's going to get them all the data they want. But in the meantime, we might, have the Christmas tree problem where we've got a lot of them hanging off of any individual person. And thinking about that integration gets more complex with the number of components that you're thinking about integrating there too.
John, not to play the contrarian, I think you have to look at what's in front of us, but what's in front of us is a lot of noise. I think you have to balance that view with a long-term view of where the world's going, right? And sitting back, because it's much easier to imagine the future 10 years from now than it is what's going on today because of that noise that's going on today. And frankly, all the technologies that's going to be there in 10 years are distributed. Today, they're just, they're not highly distributed, and they will be in the future. So I agree with you 100%, but I think that you have to balance that out. And that's what helps you to focus in the right areas, like I said, to start to build that competency. So when the technologies are at scale, you're an operator. You've got competency around it, and you can capture those opportunities.
Do we have time for one more question? Anybody else? All right.
Hello, Chris Dockery, BMW. Question for you regarding your general approach is a high-level one, which I appreciate, more strategic rather than tactical. If you look back to the beginning of the 20th century, the typical bag of cement was 200 pounds, and people were strong enough to pick it up. My grandmother, at 87, dug her garden, which was 25 feet by 100 feet, with a shovel. So aging is not a disease. And I keep wondering, are we converging on the lowest common denominator so that we're turning everyone into people sitting at desks, aren't moving, trying to control all the risks? I go back to the concept of eustress from Hans Selye, who said that there's a minimum and there's sort of an optimal level of stress. If you have too much, it's bad, and we're all kind of focused on that. We know that. But is there too little? And is that something that any of you are considering, sort of having a minimum level of stress that we have because it's actually good for people. And I don't talk about psychological stress. I'm talking about physical stress, work stress, that kind of thing. Is that something any of you are considering?
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah. Another question I could go in a number of different directions about, but I would argue with respect to material handling, and I get this a lot where, hey, I did this on the farm. Why can't I do it here? Or, yeah, 30 years ago I did this. Why can't I do it now? And I do use the terminology of industrial athlete. Yes, we want you to be a strong, healthy person. But at the same time, I don't think there was that much knowledge 50 years ago of what is ergonomics. As a matter of fact, if you look at data around carpal tunnel syndrome or historically referred to as cumulative trauma disorders, that stuff didn't get reported 50 years ago, right? Nobody knew what that was. And when OSHA started talking about it and, hey, there's this thing out there called ergonomics, and oh, wow, wait, what I'm experiencing is actually not good. Oh, I should do something about this, right? Now, I speak from somebody as, my mom worked the assembly line, right, in the automotive industry, and she had to have surgery. And she didn't know. I mean, it got to that point. She just didn't recognize the symptoms, the issues that it could lead to something as significant as requiring a very invasive procedure that she still to this day is dealing with quality of life issues from. Now, that might not happen to everybody, and maybe this person did successfully garden without incident, but again, as safety professionals, we need to be preventative in our approach and protective of our entire worker population. Now, the other extreme you mentioned is also hazardous, and we have a number of people who spend 12 hours a day sitting in an office typing at a computer workstation, which has its own set of hazards, and I'm sure you all have seen the headlines about sitting is the new smoking and all of these correlations of health impacts from sitting all day, and a lot of you are staring at your screens right now. There's a lot of psychosocial issues with working in isolation, blue light from the screens. I could go on. So I think that we have dual challenges here, and there's a happy medium in between where we don't want you lifting the 500 pounds, and at the same time, we don't want you sitting all day. As human beings, from an evolutionary perspective, we are designed to be moving around. And what's attractive about the exoskeleton technology is you still have mobility and you have augmentation, but it's not completely replacing you as a human. It's taking the benefit of a robot, and it's taking what's amazing about us as human beings and combining the best of both worlds together, at least from a vision perspective. I think we know the technology has a little ways to mature yet, but on the surface, that's the concept we're trying to do, is take what's out there in a technology space that can make us as humans work better and experience a better quality of life long term.
Jim, did you have a final thought on that? I know you were.
No, I think Cathy covered it. We've got some folks leaning against the door back there. I don't want to belabor it. It's a good summation.
All right. Well, thank you all for your time and attention here.